tricky, unresolved issues that this perspective brings up. But I think being able to look at these issues in a comparative light is very helpful. We've spoken a lot about roads and tracks, and that is a very critical issue with regard to Icelandic wilderness. And in fact, much of the debates that have concerned wilderness preservation can be related back to the issue of roads and tracks. And I think one thing that I took from your presentation is that the US example, far from being clear-cut, is actually much more nuanced. So that provides us with certain hope that it's not necessarily either or, but we can find some sort of middle road in terms of where we allow access and to what extent.
Or a middle way, if we want to keep the roads out.
Yeah, we could talk about semantics, but middle way, okay. We can deal with that. Now, I also found it very interesting, one of your early slides, when you were comparing the proposed border of the Central Highland National Park with the biodiversity hotspots. Of course, you chose one dimension of that, which was the important bird areas. Can you bring that up again?
There were a couple, but
yeah, and I think this is a real problem, and it has a number of different dimensions. One of them is this systematic disconnect between biodiversity conservation and wilderness conservation in Iceland. And this reflects this quite well.
so it's kind of two components, but they're actually more or less the same in the end. But the thing to notice is that most of the key bird areas are along the coast, with certain oases and exceptions in the highland. And the other is these key biodiversity areas, which is mostly defined by birding. So that's how they're similar, but those also, it's a similar trend. It's mostly along the coast with some key areas in the highland, but even these aren't mapped onto or tracking the same with wilderness. Yeah. And wilderness here is defined as basically like what's still left as something without roads and distance from roads and infrastructure. Because this could be challenged too. We could say, well, just because this is the wilderness that is left here doesn't mean that you couldn't make a wilderness that encapsulates that. You could. That would be much, much harder politically. Because that means you have to get rid of something that's, or not allow the perpetuation of something that's already there. But just to add a little bit more caveat, I kind of went really fast through a lot of stuff. But,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think, to say there are a lot of dimensions contributing to this. But my take, which is that the main problem with the ideology of wilderness preservation in Iceland is not roads or tracks. It's the fact that in the Icelandic legal definition, there is no nature. And we could look at that text that you had, but I know a lot of people know this definition by heart. And its emphasis is mainly on these anthropogenic, technical infrastructure items, such as pylons, reservoirs, built-up roads. It doesn't really say anything about the nature. What it is that characterizes wild nature in Iceland. And this it is the core thing, because this is something which is in nature conservation law. And we want to preserve wilderness as sort of a quintessential nature. Amongst all of the natural values that we have in Iceland, and I love your idea of Iceland as a national park. This is the core thing. And therefore this mismatch that you presented quite clearly, even with limited data, and this tells us there is something really wrong about this. And I should add that this not only stemming from the ideology or philosophy of wilderness conservation, it's also stemming from the ideology of philosophy of biodiversity conservation. Another huge missing link in all of this is not biodiversity or wildlife, which is really, really important historically in how wilderness has been conceptualized, but is geodiversity and landscape, which is probably the reason why, one of the reasons why we have this mismatch, because the central highland of Iceland is primarily valuable for its pronounced geodiversity and landscape diversity. And
which is one thing I could still touch on, but I think I used my time more or less. So
anyway, I'm not, don't want to steal your thunder, but spurning, endilega bara algjörlega opið, endilega bauna á hann hefur mjög þykkan skrá, sko.
Yeah, I can comment, because I think that it's also about the use of words. Wilderness and national parks are not the same, and they're not describing the same thing. And obviously, in America, you will allow or think of the wilderness area could be populated as of, but in our culture or in our how we perceive wilderness is that it's not populated. It's not possible to be populated, and also the use of the wilderness area just for grazing and for viewing and accessing. That's also been under very people do not agree on how to use the area, and I think you're very right. We need to kind of regulate it or find out where we want the mass of tourists and how we are going to use this or all our land.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. One thing I'll just comment on your comment is that in the U.S. Wilderness Act, part of the definition is where man is a visitor who does not remain. So it is actually explicitly stated that in designated wilderness, there can be no human settlements or human population. In the Gates of the Arctic instance, essentially it's kind of a cookie cutter cutout surrounded by the wilderness on at least 3 sides. Actually, the 4th side is no longer in the park. It is state land, so that's a different story. But so it's kind of operating similar to like what I was showing with the roads and the reservoir, where the wilderness line is just kind of drawn around it. And we say, okay, we can do that. So you can still maintain a non-populated wilderness that is kind of populated in this one instance. The other thing to note is that in this instance, the residents do tend to stick pretty close in for their subsistence activities. Like it's pretty rare that they're really actually accessing in the park or deep in the park that often, though they have that right. So anyway, there's just add a little bit more context and caveat to that.
Yeah, just addressing Brynjar's comment, I mean, this was a change in the wilderness concept in Iceland. The original concept was called víðerni. And then in the current legislation, this was changed to Óbyggð víðerni. So from untouched to unpopulated. There's a core problem here, is that these two words in Icelandic, they are referring to one word in English, which is wilderness. But we tend to focus on the first part. So I've been in many, many debates over the years about how nature, víðerni, can be untouched, you know, in terms of when we have climate change, when we have persistent pollutants all over the place. And then the same applies to unpopulated. I mean, are no people allowed in wilderness? Isn't wilderness one of the main reasons we want to preserve wilderness is for us to have experiences of solitude, to have experiences of wild, untamed nature. So people, where are people in the equation?
But maybe that's where we're wrong, and just in the end base, because you should not just be protecting wilderness for us, you should also be protecting wilderness for the wilderness' sake. So if we're just protecting it for us, we're always thinking about using it in some way, and that's just wrong, I think. So I think that may be where we're basically going south from the road that we should be traveling.
Yeah, and taking up that line of thought is actually more in a way more interesting in the Icelandic case, because I think it's easier to justify something for its own sake in that way in the biotic context. Like, this has a tremendous amount of biodiversity or some key species, you know, like big bears and big grazing animals are living there, their wild lives. So that's kind of like, in and of itself, it's valuable. And it's harder, I think, to conceptualize and justify that when it's like bare and stark volcanic rock. It's like, is that really valuable just in and of it? Like, there's no sentience there, presumably. Sentience adds a lot to this discussion of for its own sake. When you remove largely the sentience component, it's kind of like, I think you could still do it. It's a little, maybe harder.
Yeah, and of course we also want to use our land and we want to build up and be prosperous as ourselves, so there's also conflict. But if you also look at the municipality that we are currently in here, over 80% of it is protected in some way by some kind of nature or water protection. Still, we want to live here, we want to use the land, we want to prosper and be able to grow. So it's also because of your idea of Iceland as a whole, as a nature conservation area or conservation area, it's interesting because in some ways it is, even though it's not a wilderness protection area. And I think it's also very important for us to focus on when we're protecting areas that we have the focus on why we are protecting it and what we are protecting it for, and not necessarily always what we are protecting it from, but what we are protecting it for. And that's what I think where we are very often going wrong.
Yeah, that's the Dory's point about the definition.
Yeah. So,
it's a textbook example, because the definition just tells us what we're protecting it from, all these intrusive anthropogenic impacts. It doesn't say anything about what is the actual value of what the protection is about, what we're protecting for. Excellent point.
Just if you are clear on that, what you're protecting and why, it's also easier for people or possible users or people who have great ideas that are crazy to understand why things should not be done here, but you can rather do them in another place, and that's an easier discussion, and people understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think
also, you know, the question of what's the power over the areas. It's a key question, and for me, it's the main reason why the national parks in Iceland are not expanded. It's not only necessary, you know, you don't even though we have wilderness, national parks, or protected areas, it's about who governs these areas, who can take the decisions. Are the decisions taken by local interests in mind, or some other interests in mind? And the example you took from Óbyggð is a clear example of rights that's taken from a certain group of people. And from my point of view, it's not abnormal that someone stands up and protect against it. I think it's totally normal. And myself, when I walked through Óbyggð, of course you can see the track. It didn't bother me, but of course I can understand people that bothers people if you're walking and you're expecting, just quiet, time in the nature, in the wilderness, and then you can expect a car passing by. But I think this question about power is really, really important, and that has not been solved. And we have now good examples of the governance, if the governance is proper or not for these national areas, national protected areas.
Yeah, there's a couple of good points. One is in my Ísland National Park idea, it brings up the issue of governance and power. And I wasn't meaning to imply that. I mean, I knew that it was raising that question because the way I had it drawn, like, oh, Reykjavik has total power over the whole land. That's not what I meant. It was more just the quality of the landscape throughout the entirety of Iceland. But it definitely, you should have an alarm bell there. Like, oh wait, who has control over this? And I also really like your point about the track in Óbyggð. Actually, I didn't get to go because the road was closed the time I was trying to go finally. But that to me is one key thing to seize on, is that the fact that there's a track, just in my mind, I'm like knowing a vehicle has been here. This area belongs to vehicles in some way already. Vehicles are in my mind, just because the track is there. And also, it could come. There's always the chance that it could come. Maybe it won't. Maybe I'll go 100 times, it won't come. But I always know it could be coming. So I know, I don't, in both of these ways, like through the experiential, psychological side, if a wilderness allows for a track, even if it's not a common occurrence, it still tethers you into the mechanized world. And you still have this, you're still on alert for this and thinking of this. And so it's a connection issue. So that's partly why I don't like the Icelandic wilderness provision by, at least the way it's interpreted, to allow tracks. But also with all the caveats I just mentioned, that it's not as stark as how I originally been thinking of it based on this U.S. comparison.
I think this is really informative because you are giving us the perspective of a hiker. And this is one of the problems that we have, is that we aren't able to have an honest discussion about what it is that is actually important to different kinds of people. And I came to this realization when we conducted a study some 10 years ago, which included interviews with stakeholders, including 4x4 members. And having read these interviews, I gained a very different perspective on these people. They're us, they're part of our community. I could also speak of hikers as being these people. And this is the thing. For each recreational group, there are certain very, very important values that are attached to their preferred mode of recreation. And the way the system works is they are always being pitted together. Sometimes it's inevitable. There are places where motorized access and wilderness hiking are going to be incompatible. But that is not the rule. But the way we see it is that we always have this debate interfering in the decisions that we need to make as a collective. We need to find a consensus, a middle way. Not everybody is going to get everything they want, but we can at least make sure that we are finding a fairly fair way of distributing these values and resources. So my point here is that, you know, because we've been stuck in these trenches in skotgröfum for so long that we never get past them. We don't have the chance to understand what it is that the other person truly values. Why driving through Vonarskar is so important for certain people. Whereas having a track there, even an extremely rough track, which requires the fording of at least 2 huge glacier rivers, which from my understanding is one of the reasons why the 4x4 people want to go that way. You know, we can, if we talk about this in terms of values, there is a certain common ground that we can talk about. If we only think about it in terms of interests, then we're already creating a conflict, because then we have competition. My interests should be equal to your interests. But it's not about that. It's about the values that are at stake. The values which I would contend are intimately related to the natural character of the area. And the nature is where these values spring from. I'm pontificating, I wasn't the point. But before we say goodbye, I want to see if anybody wants to comment on Chris's idea of this striate, this
I call it a two-tiered system.
Two-tier system. Because I know there has been, within the 4x4 community, there has been a lot of discussion about the impact of foreign traffic in the highlands. And the examples that you were showing us from Alaska, they suggest that it may be possible to differentiate between the natives, and it's not necessarily only the indigenous, but that's maybe where it springs from, but just the natives of the area and visitors. And so, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, no, I want to hear your thoughts for sure, but I'll just say a little bit. One is that in Alaska, this is like one of the most contentious issues in terms of who gets to harvest wildlife. Like Anchorage people, which is the big city in Alaska, want access to that. And the fact that they would be prohibited is like, it's like no holds barred on that. Like, we're going to get access. And anyway, so it's not like clean cut and easy. And there's this difference between state regulation and federal regulation. So I've been describing federal rules. Federal rules allow this kind of access. State rules don't, because of these powerful urban interests that want to maintain that access. So this is just about hunting and gathering, but you could apply a similar kind of thinking to motorized access too. But just to make it known that it's not like kumbaya holding hands. It's like, it's very contentious.
It's just, I feel that the origin of most of those tracks is from collecting sheep all over the place. You know, that's how they became the first in the beginning, and are still used for that purpose. So, you know, what are we going to do? Herd the sheep by helicopter, or how are we going to do this if we can't have tracks?
Yeah, so that's really similar to that parallel to the Alaska situation, which is the motorized access is mainly for subsistence use, just the gathering of wildlife, you know, versus like semi-domestic sheep. But it's a very similar idea that they're not there just for fun. They're there because their livelihood depends on it in some way. So it's an interesting.
I think it's a bigger issue than just about motorized vehicles. I think it's also about, because we have traditionally law here in Iceland, which is about almannaréttur, which is about the right of everyone to use the land in a certain way. And certainly we are not only 300,000 people who are using this law to our benefit, but a few millions who just say that, yeah, I have the right, it says here in the law that I have the right to do like this and this and this. And I think it's about, it also has to be about this. So if we're going to have a kind of of a two-tier, some kind of separated rights. It has to evolve around more than just motorized vehicles. It has to be around the access and the possible uses of the land. And it's also because many Icelanders feel that all these tourists that are coming here, and we want them in one way, but they are restricting access for us ourselves in other ways. But there are all kinds of things happening.
Yeah, and one other point to add to that is I read an article that came out in May. It was an English language paper, Arctic paper, that an economist in Reykjavik said, we want to see, I don't know if it's a projection or a desire, 1 million residents in Iceland. So up until now, a lot of these issues haven't really become issues because your population was small enough, there was less of a stark urban-rural divide. But that's, I mean, who knows if 1 million is realistic, but the fact that some people are thinking that and maybe even desiring it, that's going to amplify these issues big time. And you're going to have to come to terms with this. Like, not 1 million people living here, not everyone can go out there and just do whatever they want anymore. That would be ridiculous. So, yeah, there's every man's right, but the sinner can't hold on that in an urbanizing, increasingly urbanizing society in certain ways. At least I'll posit that as a thought.
In the 1970s, it was predicted that the Icelandic nature could provide 1 million sheep grazing over here. So, and they continued to get more and more and more sheep until it got a little bit over 700,000. That 700,000 sheep, that means the ones that are kept in house in the winter. So probably there was around 3 times that in the highlands over the summer. The land degraded very, very, very fast. So I think we can just relate to that. If we want to have 1 million people here, we have to be careful, and we have to do it in steps, and we have to prepare the land ourselves and the infrastructure.
Okay, but if there's no burning question?
I'll just throw out a couple really quick concluding thoughts, if that's all right.
Thank you.
Just a couple things came up that I just wanted to comment. One is this issue of terminology. In the US, we settled on wilderness. But actually, it wasn't always that simple. Leading up to that, there were different terms. Like, one was primitive area. Another one was like canoe area. So it was kind of like, I mean, it seems like it was just this clear cut just popped out at the end, wilderness. But actually, it could have been other things. Just like it's kind of evolved in the Icelandic context, it evolved in the US context too. So to make that clear. And then the really last thing I wanted to share, just really quickly on this, is that I had a lot of experience of Icelandic areas, and comparing it to Alaska, when I got around Hofsjökull, I really felt like I was back in Denali. It was the one time I was like, wow, I really feel like this is like wilderness, like this trailless wilderness. It really felt so familiar in a weird way. So that was just my experience that I didn't get to talk about this whole thing, but I wanted to at least relate that in this comparative way. So that's all I got. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.